Hello, everybody, and Happy New Year. It is time for the STL Metro East Weather Monthly Outlook for the month of January 2022, the first month of the new year. Of course, these monthly discussions will typically come out around the end of the month and will be, of course, for the upcoming month. Sometimes they may carry over into the first, depending on my recording schedule and everything else. But we are going to try to get this out on New Year's Eve, so you should be seeing it New Year's Day by the time it is posted. Now, of course, as we review the previous month of December, of course, it was a very warm month. It featured pretty bad patterns for cold weather. This included mostly the time a positive NAO, or North Atlantic Oscillation, a positive Arctic Oscillation, and a negative Pacific North American Ensemble. This typically results in ridging in the eastern half of the United States and much of the South, and keeps most of the cold air locked up to the northwest and into Canada, as well as into Siberia. However, we are going to see changes to these patterns over time, as well as some other subliminal things that should make January a much more meaningful winter month for the St. Louis bi-state region, including both Missouri and Illinois. So, in summary, of course, these monthly outlooks will include usually temps, trends, which will kind of discuss kind of the general conditions that you can expect through the month, patterns, that's kind of again kind of shows where the storm systems are most likely to track, and doesn't mean they're guaranteed to track over those areas, but to kind of give a rough idea of where I think the jet streams and the overall major players like ridges and troughs will tend to set up. So, with all further ado, let's get into it. Now, we are, of course, as before, we are going to start with the temperatures. Now, as we stated before, December was one of the warmest Decembers on record. I believe it was maybe in the top 5. I'm going to have to check on that, although that data will not be out for at least a couple of weeks. And, of course, but nevertheless, it was a very warm month, and generally a warm fall in general. The below normal fall outlook I kind of had initially just kind of didn't pan out when I did that back in late October, or not August, I believe. And yeah, that's the weather sometimes. It just doesn't work out. But I have been having strong feelings about January working out, and I do think based on the models as well as again the changes of the ensembles, oscillations, that we should be heading into that direction. So, as you see before you, this is the generalized map for North America. The Missouri-Illinois bi-state, of course, being in this area, which is what most people are going to be concerned about, but sometimes we might get some possible national viewers, so that's why sometimes we'll go ahead and show a national map, just to kind of also help further explain where I kind of think the patterns are going to set up. So, as you see here, we're expecting a very cold January for the northern Midwest, specifically North Dakota, Minnesota, northern Wisconsin, northern Michigan, parts of South Dakota, but anywhere in the dark blue zone, including parts of Montana. Again, more of South Dakota, Iowa, northern Illinois, and most of the remainder of Michigan will be featuring much below normal temperatures, as much as 5 degrees below or even more Fahrenheit below the seasonal norms. Now, as we creep on down to the St. Louis bi-state region, right around that area, we are kind of in the cusp between the 2 to 3 to 1 to 2 degrees Fahrenheit below normal average. So that means we do have the potential of catching at least side skirts from the worst of the Arctic outbreaks, but they may not be full dead-on solid punches, as you would expect with the higher cold anomalies being north. As we move further south, the Arctic air gets a little bit less penetrative, and that's where you start getting into the light blue zones, like the half degree, and then the white zone, which is kind of the equal chances or near normal conditions, where it's plus or minus half a degree Fahrenheit from normal. And of course, where I still think the ridges will set up, and I'll explain that more as we get to the patterns map, is I think there'll be a ridge here, and generally a ridge here, with the trough kind of riding around in this area where the main bulk of the trough is going to reside. During these ridges, of course, that's where you can expect the warm weather. So you have a pretty large area of a half a degree above normal across much of the southern states, including the Gulf Coast, and into much of the Southwest and the North Atlantic. But in there, we also have a darker orange shade that includes Southern California, far southern Nevada, Arizona, southern Mexico, and western Texas, as well as also into the east. We have eastern Louisiana, all the way to the Florida Panhandle, and parts of southern and central Georgia, the Midlands of the Carolinas, South and North Carolina, as well as also the southeastern tip of Virginia and a little bit of Delaware. And a red zone that will be extending down, of course, far southern California, far southern Arizona, far southwestern New Mexico, and into far western Texas, and another zone that will extend through much of Florida, the far southeastern corner of Georgia, and the low countries of North and South Carolina. So that is the general idea of the temps. Now let's talk about the trends. Now the trends, of course, like you said, where most of the cold air is going to be across the north, that's also generally where the storm tracks are going to be going. So you'll probably see a theme in this map with a lot of cold and wet weather in these areas. The coldest being in here, where I expect the Arctic attack zone to be. That's where you can see some pretty big swings from time to time. It doesn't mean it's going to be, absolutely frigidly, bitterly cold all the time. There will be, I think, moderating breaks every now and then. But you can expect some pretty big departures from time to time, as much as 15 to 25 degrees or more below normal at times. And we could see a lot of sub-zero readings in this area as well, especially for nightly lows and even daytime highs north of Interstate 80 could be seeing quite a bit of cold weather across that area. But even down here in the southern part, it should kind of be split. We can still expect to see single digits, frequent 20s and teens for highs in the cold shots. Maybe some days, if we get snow on the ground, could see single digits for highs and maybe even sub-zeros for lows. And generally pretty cold most of the time. Again, not all the time. There will still be some mild shots from time to time, especially ahead of these any southern storms, or even some clippers can sometimes be nefarious for bringing quite warm weather out ahead of them if we end up on the southern end of them. Across the northeast, you can expect colder, snowier weather. This is where I think most of the snow compared to normal will occur. Pretty much really anywhere in about roughly this zone, which would extend from eastern Illinois, northern Kentucky, Indiana, Ohio, much of West Virginia, into a little corner there of Maryland, much of Pennsylvania, New York, into Massachusetts, Vermont, New Hampshire, and into Maine. Coastal areas, again, I think they will be plagued by similar lows and 50-50 lows. Details of those type of lows and systems I might potentially discuss in future videos, as far as what those mean in depth, if that becomes something people request. As well as also northeasters that can sometimes start as low as Florida and then kind of track their way off the eastern coast. And there could cause some more mixing, so that's why I'm not going full snow here and calling it just cooler and stormy. But I expect a lot of mixing and, yes, a few snow events potentially to get around these areas, especially around the middle end of the month. I think is where there'd be the best shot for this area of the country to get a pretty decent snow. Meanwhile, as we get to the lower Ohio Valley and into the Tennessee Valley and into the area of the South, we do see cooler patterns still continuing. And also, I think on the northern half of this, we will have to deal with a few mixing events, and yes, even some moderate snow events from time to time. And maybe think about maybe 2 or 3 such events in that area. South of the area, however, I'm much more concerned about severe storms. Periodically, if we get any southern storms that typically track from, say, the Baja region of California, move up into New Mexico, and kind of take a similar path roughly around there. And I'll kind of be better described when I do the jet stream pattern of the month. Again, this is a pattern pretty consistent of a negative NAO and a negative AO pattern that I'm expecting to become established by mid to late month, with the trough in the east and a ridge kind of in the west. But because it's not a full-on negative or strong, intense negative period, the ridging is not going to be quite as pronounced in the west, but it will occasionally poke into even the Pacific Northwest, I think, from time to time, but just not enough to really change the swing of things as far as the average trend conditions. But I'm expecting much of the warmth to stay generally south of I-70, And generally, in that regard, that's pretty much how it falls. Again, until you get to about the Ozarks, and then we kind of get this dip where I think the jet stream will be diving south into Tennessee and into Virginia and going up that way. So, with that in the area in this weak ridging, I do expect mild to warm periods of wet and dry. Doesn't mean it'll be dry all the time. It won't be wet all the time. You might get a storm system that comes through, sits for a few days, and then you might be dry for 7 or 10 days. Repeat the pattern again, get another system last 3 to 5 days, and then dry for a week. And that kind of thing. Until these storms get east enough, then they can start picking up more Gulf moisture from the Gulf of Mexico, pulling it north, and of course the cold Arctic air coming south, and that's pretty much a perfect recipe for severe storms in this particular zone that I'm highlighting roughly in this area is where I do think we could be seeing some severe storms from time to time, but especially in this area in particular is where I think we could see the most strongest of it, and the most higher probabilities for storms and tornadoes. Again, not all the time, but I do think there could be 2 to 3 potential outbreaks in this area, which, of course, unfortunately, on the northern extent would include a lot of areas that were hit pretty hard in December around the 10th, and again on New Year's Eve and day with the system that's currently rolling through as we speak. Generally, the Gulf Coast states, I'm expecting warm and generally dry in these areas. Again, it's kind of like here, but I think more dry than wet. There could be some showers and storms from time to time, but again, I think they will be isolated to scattered and not widespread, so not really a major factor into the as far as changing the swing of whether it's going to be dry or wet in that area. But if storms do develop, yes, they can be severe, and they may potentially, again, anywhere, as I said before, in this area, could potentially produce, occasionally, if you get a strong enough system with the right environment, could produce your strong damaging winds, some hail, and also tornadoes, along with flash flooding and lightning and all the other fanfare that typically comes with thunderstorms. So, moving on to our patterns. This is kind of just some thought bubbles and some ideas I kind of have where I think the pattern is going to try to set up. Again, it looks worse than it is in this area. It's really not going to be that bad. As far as being like, oh, it's going to be, if it says sleet and snow, it's going to sleet and snow all the time. No, it's not. Some people might get the wrong impression of that. It just means that's where I suspect the setup for the best chances of major systems to occur will be in that, kind of pink shaded area, with the smaller inner area of the heavy snow, which is close to where I think these lows really start wrapping up as they start getting east of the Missouri-Illinois bi-state area. So southeastern Illinois, southern Indiana, Kentucky, Ohio, and again parts of Pennsylvania, in upstate New York, and into Quebec could see, I think, the heaviest snows, but that doesn't mean you can't get snow in any of these areas. It just means I think it's more likely than not that it's going to occur or have a higher chance of occurring in the upper Ohio Valley and into the interior states of the Northeast. A bit further south, of course, again, there's where I think we could see some mixing events from time to time. Yes, it does overlap a little bit with the severe weather zone, but that's just because, again, of the uncertainty of exactly where each individual storm will set up. But, I can expect 1 to 2 mixing events, even as far south as Oklahoma, into Texas, into Georgia, and even the Carolinas, especially away from the coast, could potentially be, could see a sleet or ice stormy type of thing occurring. And of course, down here in the south, pretty much just rain and storms, and yes, again, some severe, but again, that kind of really extends really about that, pretty much almost the entire southeast, really, to be honest, up into the Ohio River. Could potentially, receive severe storms, but your chances go higher the further south you go. Up in the north, we have, of course, as you might probably more see, is, of course, the placement I think the average jet streams will be occurring. So, where I think doesn't mean it will be like this the whole month, it just means I think overall the trend will be for a pretty deep trough of the polar vortex to kind of extend in there. As seen here, and of course the Clipper systems that tend to come out of Alberta, Manitoba, even British Columbia, typically like to start around this area and move into Montana and kind of dive east of the Front Range Rockies and then kind of turn east as they move into Kansas and into Missouri, and then eventually kind of turn north again as they hit the Appalachians and begin curving back towards, like I said, Quebec and into the maritime Canada region. And some of them may even go into the east and may even get secondary low developments that may begin to shift north, and these can eventually become your Miller A lows and 50/50 lows, or even just a general garden variety nor'easters if you get these secondary lows when one piece of storm weakens, makes another low that strengthens and becomes the dominant low as time goes along. And these clipper systems are very nefarious sometimes for doing that, especially if you do get a southern system or a disturbance that kind of, starts here and then kind of dives in and kind of mixes in with it. The combination of those two can create some pretty impressive storms in that area, especially around, again, the mid-Atlantic states into the Northeast, and pretty much going from there. Of course, generally the southern storms is where we get most of our heavier snows here in St. Louis. If we have especially if there's a moderate trough present, you can get some snow here, and that's why I think we'll have maybe two or maybe three of these type of systems. I'm looking potentially, even one I'm tracking potentially around the 6th and the 8th could be coming pretty similar passion, and even eventually combining with a clipper that could be coming around as well at the same time, and ultimately fusing somewhere in this area and then shooting off northeast. And like I said, that system I think could have the potential for a potentially, let's just say, significant snowfall, which means more than a few inches for the area. Right, so I'm not really getting too much into specifics as there's way too much to change, but the chances of snow occurring between the 6th through the 7th and possibly into the 8th time period do seem to be on the increase. And I do think we will see this pattern kind of continue every 7 to 10 days with these southern storms. But in between those, we may get these weak clipper systems that may also come on their own, specifically looking at one maybe around the 10th. Also another one that could become around the 14th through the 16th. Again around perhaps the 23rd, and again around the 28th, 29th, right around the end of the month. Could feature these little clipper systems. The exact timing is not really super specific, but it kind of gives the idea. I'm kind of expecting, these systems to kind of occur, starting after, not so much this week, but starting next week, the first full week of January, that we could start to see this pattern start to establish itself as we get another shot of the polar vortex, as you see placed over there, could start to come into play with the NAO and the AO going negative, which again favors a trough in the east and getting out of their positive phases. But it will take a little time to get there, as they'll have to go through the neutral phase for a while, and that's going to cause a pattern to flux a bit. And that's what we're going to really be seeing the first 2 weeks of the month, I think, is you'll get these cool periods, make it really cold for a couple days, and then warm up for a little bit, but nothing ridiculous, just back to average, or maybe 5-10 degrees above average, not like what we saw in December, where we had 60s and 70s and even some 80s. Not expecting that, but think more like maybe 40s and maybe 50s. But again, mixed in with mostly dominant periods, I think will be spent largely in the 30s and 40s. And during the really cold shots up until about mid-month, you could see maybe highs that don't even get out of the low mid-20s. Particularly, namely, looking at Sunday being one such example. So in this area of corner, like I said, the polar vortex is here. Now, the real polar vortex, don't expect it to get established here really until about the last 2 weeks of the month. But once it does, it will be pulling in these disturbances down, and even though the moisture is very sparse in this area, I think these couple of these systems could be quite full of intensity and have a lot of lift with them. So we could see some snow develop on them. And sometimes these clipper systems can be prolific occasionally if they're stout enough to produce several inches or even more of very light, powdery, puffy snow that can accumulate very quickly but doesn't have a lot of liquid water in it. So it kind of just almost evaporates away more than so much it melts. But it'll be very high ratio stuff. Think 20-to-1 ratios, or maybe even higher, depending exactly on the air mass at the time. So generally, what the general story short is we do expect to at least have several opportunities for winter systems over the time period. Like I said, doesn't mean every single one will produce snow. Like I said, a clipper may end up being a little further north, in which case we either get nothing or we just get maybe a warm day and maybe some breezy conditions and or maybe a few showers, or heck, I can't even rule out the possibility of a storm if it's enough moisture can connect from the Gulf in time. But again, generally the south side of clippers aren't generally very prolific in precipitation, so you could get high and dry, or you could get on the northern part of the system if the clipper tracks more this way, and we can get, pretty decent snow hit here in the bi-state area. So generally, here's things to remember in January. Of course, the big thing is January will be significantly colder than December. That is pretty much a guarantee. I'm not calling for a record cold month, but it will definitely be much colder than normal and probably be a shock to the system for some people after a pretty mild winter we've had so far and most of autumn that we've had to deal with so far. Again, as we stated before, several opportunities exist for wintry weather, but not all will be a blockbuster storm, but a couple could be major or at least significant, causing travel delays and other particular types of events, flight cancellations, things like that, and other things that come with it. And of course, extreme cold can be a hazard of itself, so you may have to bundle up a little more on some days. Also, of course, the big key change here is, of course, the NAO. I did put a dash there. That does usually represent negative NAO, but it's meant to just represent a bullet in this case. But it does say that NAO, also known as the North Atlantic Oscillation, will be positive to start, but it's generally going to be trending neutral, I think, by the time we hit about the 7th to the 10th of the month. And then about the time we hit Martin Luther King Day, I think it will begin to turn negative. How negative it goes, nobody really knows yet. Forecasts are not calling for anything major, but it will be enough to create the pattern change that we need. Same for the same for the AO, or also known as the Arctic Oscillation. That's the area around Alaska, and again, I'll probably almost certainly make separate videos of these ensembles, kind of what they mean and what you can kind of expect when one is in one phase and one is in the other, kind of at an individual level in time. But just basically note that this is generally good news if you want winter weather. The fact that this pattern is trending in the right direction. The Pacific North American, or the PNA, of course, starts negative, and that generally means a trough in the Pacific coast and a ridge that's in the Central Pacific, which kind of unfortunately tends to pump a ridge in the east. But it will be trending towards the positive phase, which will tend to create a ridge in the west and a trough in the east. So a lot of things signifying that trough coming into the central and eastern U.S. All right, and we kind of lost our bullet points there. See if I can bring it back. Okay, there we go. Sorry about that. And like I said, so the polar vortex specifically, it will be undergoing a moderate displacement event, and maybe even a brief split, depending if we can get some sudden stratospheric warming going on. Again, more features to talk about maybe later, but generally, again, it typically means that this is all stuff that occurs aloft, think like the stratosphere, as we kind of mentioned before, and above, but that does have effects down at the troposphere, but there's usually a lag effect of about 7 to 14 days for when an event undergoes there before it hits the surface. So again, it kind of falls in line with that Martin Luther King Day prediction of, I'm kind of thinking where the hardcore winter is going to start, is when that happens. Now, it's going to be a brief split, and the polar vortex will, I think, pull back together by the time we get to the end of the month, but that could potentially set us up for something later in February, even March. Time will tell. So again, just another bullet point was kind of getting to earlier. Coldest period does look like, again, the 15th, or I should say, looks to start around the 11th to the 15th of the month. Maybe more leaning on the second half, and then moderate again maybe in the last week of the month. And again, that's when I think the polar vortex might actually re-strengthen again, and that typically we also may see some of these ensembles go back neutral again, or even to their inverse phases, kind of where they start going back ridging. But again, I'm not expecting anything huge as far as any historic warm-ups or anything like that, or certainly nothing long-lived. And, as we get into February, I'll describe more of that pattern, but in the meantime, that is basically it in a nutshell. So January will be a colder month, pretty stormy month. Not all the time. There will be some dry time, quite a bit, in fact. But when we do get the stormy times, there could be a lot more wintry weather than we've been used to the past, since basically last winter. And again, just there's that chance that you'll have to stay tuned and keep an eye on things. In the meantime, hope everyone's had a great new year, and we'll see you in the next video. Signing out.